Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English is Easy with Mira. Today, I want to ask you one question. How many times a day do you say, I think? I think we should do this. I think the answer is this. I think you are right. The problem is, I think is one of the weakest phrases in English. When you say, I think, you sound unsure. You sound hesitant. You sound like you are not fully confident in what you are saying. Today, I will give you 30 powerful phrases to replace I think. These are the phrases that confident Americans use at work every single day. They will make you sound stronger, smarter, and more professional immediately. Let us begin.
Section 1. Sharing opinions. 1. Instead of saying, I think, say this. In my view. Meaning, a confident way to share your opinion. Story. Imagine giving your opinion in a meeting. Instead of starting with, I think, you say, in my view. It sounds more assured and polished. Small change, big difference. Example. In my view, we should launch the product next month. In my view, this strategy carries too much risk. In my view, the second option is the stronger choice. 2. Instead of saying, I think, say this. From my perspective. Meaning, a phrase that shows you are speaking from your own experience. Story. Imagine you want to share your point of view without sounding pushy. Instead of saying, I think, you say, from my perspective. It is respectful and confident at the same time. Example. From my perspective, the timeline needs adjusting. From my perspective, the client's concern is valid. From my perspective, we are moving in the right direction. 3. Instead of saying, I think that, say this. It is my understanding that. Meaning, a careful phrase to share what you believe to be true. Story. Imagine stating a fact you are not completely sure about. Instead of saying, I think that, you say, it is my understanding that. It sounds professional and shows you are careful with information. Example. It is my understanding that the deadline is next Friday. It is my understanding that the budget has been approved. It is my understanding that this policy applies to everyone. 4. Instead of saying, I think the numbers show, say this. Based on the data. Meaning, a strong phrase to back your opinion with evidence. Story. Imagine presenting results in a meeting. Instead of saying, I think the numbers show, you say, based on the data. It immediately makes your point sound more credible and professional. Example. Based on the data, sales have increased by 20%. Based on the data, we need to change our approach. Based on the data, customer satisfaction is improving. 5. Instead of saying, I think, say this. I would argue that. Meaning, a phrase that shows you are making a considered point. Story. Imagine defending an idea in a debate or discussion. Instead of saying, I think, you say, I would argue that. It signals that you have thought carefully about your position. Example. I would argue that the current strategy is not working. I would argue that we need more time before launching. I would argue that this is the most cost-effective solution. 6. Instead of saying, I think, say this. It seems to me that. Meaning, a diplomatic phrase to share an observation gently. Story. Imagine pointing out a potential problem in a meeting. Instead of saying, I think there is an issue, you say, it seems to me that something needs attention. It is softer and more professional. Example. It seems to me that the team needs more support. It seems to me that this decision was made too quickly. It seems to me that the client is not fully satisfied. Section 2. making suggestions. 7. Instead of saying, I think we should, say this. Perhaps we could consider. Meaning, a polite way to suggest an idea without being forceful. Story. Imagine you want to suggest something without sounding like you are giving orders. Instead of saying, I think we should, you say, perhaps we could consider. It invites discussion rather than imposing. Example. Perhaps we could consider extending the deadline. Perhaps we could consider a different approach. Perhaps we could consider meeting earlier this week. Instead of saying, I think we should try, say this. It might be worth exploring. Meaning, a phrase that opens up possibilities without pressure. Story. Imagine suggesting a new idea that is not fully formed yet. Instead of saying, I think we should try this, you say, it might be worth exploring. It sounds thoughtful and open-minded. Example. It might be worth exploring a partnership with that company. It might be worth exploring a different pricing model. It might be worth exploring what the competition is doing. 9. Instead of saying, I think you should, say this. Have you considered? Meaning, a respectful way to suggest something to a colleague. Story. Imagine giving advice to a colleague or manager. Instead of saying, I think you should do this, you ask, have you considered? It shows respect for their judgment while still sharing your idea. Example. Have you considered speaking directly with the client? Have you considered starting the project in phases? Have you considered what happens if the plan does not work? Instead of saying, I think the best way is, say this. One approach could be. Meaning, a confident yet open phrase to propose a solution. Story. Imagine presenting a solution to a problem. Instead of saying, I think the best way is, you say, one approach could be. It sounds strategic and leaves room for others to contribute. Example. One approach could be to divide the work into smaller tasks. One approach could be to get feedback from the client first. One approach could be to pilot the idea before full launch. 11. Instead of saying, I think we should, say this. What if we were to? Meaning, a creative phrase to introduce a new idea. Story. Imagine brainstorming in a meeting and you have a bold idea. Instead of just saying, I think we should do this, you say, what if we were to? It sparks curiosity and invites discussion. Example. What if we were to launch a trial version first? What if we were to reach out to the client directly? What if we were to restructure the team for this project? 12. Instead of saying, I think we should, say this. I would recommend that we. Meaning, a strong, confident phrase to make a clear recommendation. Story. Imagine being asked for your professional opinion on a decision. Instead of saying, I think we should, you say, I would recommend that we. It sounds authoritative and expert. Example. I would recommend that we review the contract one more time. I would recommend that we schedule a follow-up meeting. I would recommend that we communicate this to the team early. Section 3. Expressing concerns. 13. Instead of saying, I think there is a problem with, say this. I have some reservations about. Meaning, a diplomatic way to raise a concern professionally. Story. Imagine you have a concern about a plan but do not want to sound negative. Instead of saying, I think there is a problem with this, you say, I have some reservations about. It is honest but professional. Example. I have some reservations about the proposed timeline. I have some reservations about moving forward so quickly. I have some reservations about this approach. Can we discuss? 14. Instead of saying, I do not think, say this. I am not entirely convinced that. Meaning, a careful phrase to express doubt without being dismissive. Story, imagine someone presents an idea you are not sure about. Instead of saying, I do not think this will work, you say, I am not entirely convinced that. It opens a conversation rather than closing one. Example, I am not entirely convinced that this is the right timing. I am not entirely convinced that the data supports this. I am not entirely convinced that we have explored all options. 15. Instead of saying, I think we have a problem with, say this. This raises a question about. Meaning, a calm phrase to point out a gap or issue. Story, imagine spotting a potential issue in a plan. Instead of saying, I think we have a problem with this, you say, this raises a question about. It sounds analytical rather than critical. Example, this raises a question about the budget allocation. This raises a question about how we will measure success. This raises a question about the client's expectations. 16. Instead of saying, I think something is wrong, say this. I want to flag a potential issue. Meaning, a professional way to alert someone to a possible problem. Story, imagine noticing something that could cause trouble later. Instead of saying, I think something is wrong, you say, I want to flag a potential issue. It sounds proactive and professional. Example, I want to flag a potential issue with the delivery timeline. Before we proceed, I want to flag a potential issue. I want to flag a potential issue that came up in the review. 17. Instead of saying, I think we should know that, say this. It is worth noting that. Meaning, a neutral phrase to bring something important to attention. Story, imagine sharing a piece of information that others might have missed. Instead of saying, I think we should know that, you say, it is worth noting that. It sounds calm and informative. Example, it is worth noting that the deadline has changed. It is worth noting that the client raised this concern before. It is worth noting that this approach has risks attached. 18. Instead of saying, I think we have a problem, say this. I would like to raise a concern. Meaning, a professional and respectful way to bring up an issue. Story, imagine being in a meeting where everyone agrees but you see a problem. Instead of saying, I think we have a problem, you say, I would like to raise a concern. It is calm, direct, and professional. Example, I would like to raise a concern about the proposed changes. Before we finalize this, I would like to raise a concern. I would like to raise a concern about the resource allocation. Section 4. Agreeing and building. 19. Instead of saying, yes, I think so too, say this. I completely agree with that. Meaning, a strong, clear way to show full agreement. Story, imagine someone makes a point you fully support. Instead of just saying, yes, I think so too, you say, I completely agree with that. It is clear, direct, and professional. Example, I completely agree with that assessment. I completely agree with that. Let us move forward. I completely agree with that approach for this project. 20. Instead of saying, also, I think, say this. Building on what you said. Meaning, a smooth phrase to add to someone else's point. Story, imagine a colleague makes a good point and you want to add to it. Instead of just saying, also I think, you say, building on what you said. It shows you listened and adds value. Example, building on what you said, we could also explore digital options. Building on what you said, the timeline needs revisiting. Building on what you said, I would add one more consideration. 21. Instead of saying, I think the same, say this. That aligns with my thinking. Meaning, a professional phrase showing you share the same view. Story, Imagine your colleague shares an opinion that matches yours exactly. Instead of saying, I think the same, you say, that aligns with my thinking. It sounds collaborative and engaged. Example, that aligns with my thinking on the project direction. That aligns with my thinking. I am glad we are on the same page. That aligns with my thinking about the client's needs. 22. Instead of saying, yes, I think you are right, say this. You raise a valid point, meaning a respectful way to acknowledge someone's contribution. Story, imagine someone in a meeting makes a good observation. Instead of just saying, yes, I think you are right, you say, you raise a valid point. It acknowledges their contribution professionally. Example, you raise a valid point about the scheduling conflict. You raise a valid point. Let us address that before moving on. You raise a valid point that we had not considered before. Story, imagine someone proposes an idea you are not fully sure about, but it has some good points. Instead of saying, I think that could work, you say, I see merit in that approach. It is honest and constructive. Example, I see merit in that approach. Let us explore it further. I see merit in that approach, particularly for the short term. I see merit in that approach alongside our existing plan. 24. Instead of saying, like I said, I think, say this. To echo what was said earlier, meaning a professional way to reinforce a previous point. Story, imagine a discussion has moved on, but an earlier point was important. Instead of saying, like I said, I think, you say, to echo what was said earlier. It sounds composed and strategic. Example, to echo what was said earlier, communication is key here. To echo what was said earlier, the timeline is the main concern. To echo what was said earlier, we need more data before deciding. Section 5. Presenting ideas. This last section is the most powerful of all. These are phrases that make you sound like a true professional when you present ideas. 25. Instead of saying, I think the results show, say this. The evidence suggests that. Meaning, a powerful phrase to present findings with authority. Story, imagine presenting results to your team or manager. Instead of saying, I think the results show, you say, the evidence suggests that. It sounds analytical, confident, and credible. Example, the evidence suggests that our strategy is working. The evidence suggests that customer retention has improved. The evidence suggests that we need to adjust our pricing. 26. Instead of saying, so basically I think, say this. To summarize my key points, meaning, a professional phrase to wrap up what you have said. Story, imagine finishing a presentation or a long explanation. Instead of saying, so basically I think, you say, to summarize my key points. It shows structure and confidence. Example, to summarize my key points, we need 3 things to succeed. To summarize my key points, the main risk is the timeline. To summarize my key points, I recommend we proceed with caution. 27. Instead of saying, I think we should, say this. My recommendation is to. Meaning, a clear, decisive phrase to present your final suggestion. Story, imagine being asked for your professional opinion at the end of a meeting. Instead of saying, I think we should, you say, my recommendation is to. It sounds decisive and expert. Example, my recommendation is to delay the launch by 2 weeks. My recommendation is to bring in an external consultant. My recommendation is to test this with a smaller group first. 28. Instead of saying, I think the reason is, say this. The rationale behind this is. Meaning, a professional phrase to explain your reasoning clearly. Story. Imagine explaining why you made a decision or recommendation. Instead of saying, I think the reason is, you say, the rationale behind this is. It sounds structured and thoughtful. Example. The rationale behind this is to reduce operational costs. The rationale behind this is to improve the customer experience. The rationale behind this is simple, efficiency and speed. 29. Instead of saying, I think what I mean is, say this. To put it simply, meaning, a clear phrase to explain something in plain language. Story. Imagine you have said something complex and want to make it clearer. Instead of saying, I think what I mean is, you say, to put it simply. It shows confidence and clarity. Example. To put it simply, we are spending more than we are earning. To put it simply, the plan is not working and needs to change. To put it simply, we need to act now or miss this opportunity. 30. Instead of saying, I think the main point is, say this. The bottom line is, meaning, a strong phrase to state the most important conclusion. Story. Imagine finishing a long discussion and wanting to land on the key message. Instead of saying, I think the main point is, you say, the bottom line is. It is direct, confident, and memorable. Example. The bottom line is we need to make a decision today. The bottom line is this approach will save us time and money. The bottom line is the client needs a solution by next week.
Section 1. In sharing opinions, use these. In my view, from my perspective, it is my understanding that, based on the data, I would argue that, it seems to me that. Section 2. In making suggestions, use these. Perhaps we could consider, it might be worth exploring, have you considered. One approach could be, what if we were to, I would recommend that we. Section 3. In expressing concerns, use these. I have some reservations about. I am not entirely convinced that. This raises a question about. I want to flag a potential issue. It is worth noting that. I would like to raise a concern. Section 4. In agreeing and building, use these. I completely agree with that. Building on what you said, that aligns with my thinking. You raise a valid point. I see merit in that approach. To echo what was said earlier, Section 5. In presenting ideas, use these. The evidence suggests that, to summarize my key points, my recommendation is to. The rationale behind this is, to put it simply, the bottom line is. Pick just 3 of these phrases and use them tomorrow at work or in an email. Then next week, pick 3 more. Before you know it, you will never say, I think, again. You will sound confident, professional, and impressive in English. The free phrase list for all 30 phrases is in the description. Download it now. If this video helped you, please give it a like and share it with one friend who wants to improve their professional English. Subscribe to English is Easy with Mira for a new lesson every single week. Thank you so much for watching. Keep learning, keep growing, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.